The cyber privateers are here. What happens when Washington hires companies to hack abroad? On August 12, 2026, the United States crossed a line in cyber policy that has been approached, debated, rejected, reconsidered, and approached again for more than a decade. President Donald Trump directed the federal government to establish a program under which vetted American companies may conduct cyber surveillance and cyber effects operations against foreign cyber-enabled transnational criminal organizations. The companies will not be independent vigilantes. They must operate under federal authority, submit proposed operations for approval, comply with targeting restrictions, undergo vetting and contractual controls, and act under joint Department of Justice and Department of Homeland Security oversight. That distinction is important, but it should not obscure what is actually happening. The United States is creating an institutional mechanism through which private corporations may be authorized to penetrate foreign computer systems without their owner's permission, and in approved cases, manipulate, disrupt, deny, degrade, or destroy digital infrastructure or information. The memorandum separately defines covert cybersurveillance operations as unauthorized access intended to remain undetected. That is considerably more consequential than another cybersecurity information-sharing partnership. It is the creation of a market for federally authorized offensive cyber capability. The word privateering immediately suggests itself. It is imperfect but useful. Early governments issued letters of marque allowing private maritime enterprises to use privately owned ships in pursuit of state objectives. The Constitution expressly gives Congress the power to grant letters of marque and reprisal. The new cyber program is not literally such a system. Participating companies are contractors operating under executive branch authorities rather than independently commissioned captors entitled to prizes. But the historical analogy identifies the underlying political question remarkably well. When may the state delegate coercive power to private actors, and what happens when the exercise of that power becomes a business? That question is much larger than cybersecurity. It involves war powers, law enforcement, intelligence, corporate governance, procurement, international sovereignty, attribution, escalation, surveillance, vulnerability markets, competition policy, and democratic oversight. And the answers are nowhere near settled. This is not ordinary hackback. For years, proposals to legalize corporate hackback generally imagined a company discovering that it had been attacked, and then pursuing the attacker outside its own network. That model created obvious problems. Attribution is uncertain. Attackers frequently operate through compromised third-party machines. A company attempting to disable the computer attacking it might actually be attacking another victim. The August Memorandum attempts to solve that problem by putting the government in the middle. Participating companies must contract with DOJ or DHS. Every operational package must receive written approval and direction before execution. The program must create standardized target identification procedures, conduct interagency deconfliction, establish reporting requirements, review participating companies at least annually, and require an operation to stop if it exceeds approved boundaries. That is unquestionably safer than simply declaring open season on suspected hackers, but the government control model creates a different set of problems. The corporation is no longer merely defending itself, it is performing a government mission, and that means the central question changes from, should companies be allowed to retaliate against hackers, to, under what conditions should privately employed people be authorized to exercise offensive cyber power on behalf of the United States? That is a much more difficult question. The memorandum is startlingly explicit about what that power includes. The program does not restrict private participants to reconnaissance, tracing payments, identifying infrastructure, or assisting with warrants. A cyber effects operation can produce the manipulation, disruption, denial, degradation, or destruction of information systems, networks, information, or physical and virtual infrastructure controlled by information systems. A separate category authorizes covert surveillance conducted through unauthorized access to systems, networks, telecommunications infrastructure, industrial control systems, and embedded processors. That matters because the difference between intelligence collection and offensive action can become extremely small in cyberspace. An operator who has penetrated a ransomware command server may observe it. The operator may copy its information, The operator may alter its configuration. The operator may redirect its communications. The operator may delete its encryption keys. The operator may destroy the server's contents. Technically, those actions may occur through the same access path. Politically and legally, however, they are radically different acts. One is intelligence collection, another is interference, another is destruction. The August Memorandum places all three inside the same emerging operational ecosystem. The administration did not arrive here suddenly. This is the operationalization of a policy direction announced months earlier. The White House's March 2026 cyber strategy declared that the United States would use both defensive and offensive cyber operations, create incentives for the private sector to identify and disrupt adversary networks, and build a new relationship between government and industry for national cyber defense. The March Executive Order on Cyber-Enabled Crime had already directed DOJ and DHS, supported by other agencies, to use commercial cybersecurity firms' technical capabilities, intelligence and operational knowledge to improve attribution and disruption of foreign criminal infrastructure. Congress, meanwhile, has been openly debating whether the existing architecture of American offensive cyber power is adequate. A January 2026 House hearing examined whether government and private capabilities should be integrated more aggressively, while also raising warnings that offensive activity cannot substitute for resilience and that greater offensive activity may alter international norms and provoke retaliation. The August Memorandum, therefore, does not represent an isolated improvisation. It represents the moment when an argument became an institution. And there is a serious strategic argument for doing it. It would be easy to dismiss the entire concept as reckless privatization. That would miss why the idea keeps returning. The American government possesses extraordinary intelligence and offensive cyber capabilities, but much of the terrain on which cyber conflict occurs does not belong to the government. Cloud providers see activity that intelligence agencies may not. Endpoint security companies operate sensors across enormous numbers of private systems. Telecommunications companies see routing and signaling behavior. Financial institutions see laundering patterns. Domain registrars, hosting providers, identity companies, and content delivery networks frequently encounter pieces of adversary infrastructure before federal investigators do. Congressional testimony this year explicitly recognized that much of the digital infrastructure attacked by adversaries is privately owned, and that American cybersecurity companies, cloud providers, and telecommunications firms can possess visibility rivaling or exceeding that of government organizations in particular environments. The private sector also already participates in disruption. Microsoft's Digital Crimes Unit, for example, has used civil litigation and court orders for years to seize domains and disable criminal infrastructure. In June 2026, Microsoft described another court-authorized operation disrupting infrastructure supporting StealSea and Amady malware. That model demonstrates something important. Private companies can be exceptionally good at identifying criminal infrastructure, assembling technical evidence, and rapidly interfering with cybercrime ecosystems. The crucial difference is that those operations have generally relied on consent, provider cooperation, civil process, judicial orders, or law enforcement authority. The August Memorandum extends the concept into unauthorized foreign system access, and there are situations in which that may be extremely useful. Imagine a ransomware operation using infrastructure in a jurisdiction that will not cooperate. Imagine a scam compound operating thousands of accounts while the host government does nothing. Imagine stolen credentials moving through a criminal server while American victims are actively being compromised. Imagine a botnet preparing to launch an attack against hospitals. An American security company may already know precisely which servers are involved, how the infrastructure communicates, and which technical intervention would disable it. Under the traditional model, the company reports the intelligence, then everyone waits, the adversary does not. That asymmetry is the strongest argument for the new program. Cybercrime has also become something larger than ordinary crime. The categories separating cybercrime, national security operations, and state activity have been eroding for years. Google Threat Intelligence has argued that financially motivated cybercrime itself can create national security effects because of its aggregate burden and its ability to disrupt hospitals, businesses, and critical services. Google has also emphasized that cybercriminal ecosystems frequently overlap with other actors, and that isolated takedowns rarely solve the systemic problem. At the same time, state-backed organizations increasingly coexist with contractors, freelancers, criminal groups, access brokers, and quasi-independent patriotic actors. Governments may tolerate criminals, they may recruit them, they may purchase access from them, they may protect them from prosecution, they may occasionally direct them, and they may deliberately avoid controlling them closely enough to preserve plausible deniability. That leads directly to perhaps the most troubling sentence in the August memorandum. The state connection presumption may be backwards. The program may target foreign cyber-enabled criminal organizations that are not institutional parts of foreign governments and are not wholly operated under a foreign government's direction. That sounds reassuring. Then comes the presumption. Unless clear intelligence establishes such a connection, a foreign group will be assumed not to have one. Operationally, that is extraordinary. It effectively says that uncertainty about state control initially favors treating the actor as eligible for the program, but ambiguity is precisely how proxy relationships work. A Russian ransomware group does not need to receive daily instructions from the Kremlin to benefit from political protection. An Iranian hacking collective can advance Iranian strategic objectives without appearing on a government organizational chart. A criminal contractor may conduct espionage Monday, fraud Tuesday, and a government-requested operation Friday. Former U.S. Cyber Command legal advisor Gary Korn has already pointed to the problem. Many proxy actors are not wholly directed by governments, even when governments sometimes use them. Cybersecurity experts responding to the memorandum have specifically identified groups with complicated Iranian and Russian relationships as examples of the difficulty. This suggests that the evidentiary burden may need to operate in the opposite direction. Before authorizing a destructive operation, the United States might reasonably require affirmative confidence that the proposed target is not part of a sensitive state operation. Absence of intelligence should not be mistaken for intelligence of absence. That distinction could determine whether an American contractor deletes a ransomware server or accidentally interferes with a foreign intelligence operation. And the foreign government will not care very much who signed the contractor's paycheck. This is where the concept of privatization becomes misleading. Internationally, these operations are not likely to look private at all. The memorandum requires government authorization, direction, and oversight. That strengthens accountability domestically. It also makes attribution to the United States much easier internationally. International law scholarship on state responsibility generally treats conduct by non-state actors operating under state direction or effective control as potentially attributable to the state. Research published through NATO's Cooperative Cyber Defense Center has specifically examined scenarios in which private companies perform cyber operations under government direction and concluded that state control can make the resulting conduct attributable to the directing government. So if an American contractor accidentally destroys infrastructure in France while targeting a Russian criminal organization, Paris is unlikely to regard the event primarily as corporate misconduct. Washington authorized it, Washington directed it, Washington owns the consequences. That is precisely what government oversight should mean. But it also means these companies could become instruments through which international crises begin. The internet is full of innocent intermediaries. This is the ancient problem with hackback, and federal supervision does not make it disappear. Cybercriminal infrastructure is rarely a neat collection of servers marked Russian ransomware, please destroy. Attackers compromise routers, they rent virtual machines, they hijack cloud accounts, they use residential proxies, they compromise web servers. They route traffic through other victims. A hostile IP address may belong to a dentist. A command server may share physical hardware with innocent customers. A compromised device may sit inside a hospital or university. Experts reacting to the new program have emphasized exactly this problem. Striking infrastructure associated with an attacker can mean striking infrastructure belonging to someone else. The difference between disabling an adversary's machine and disabling an innocent intermediary can sometimes be a single attribution error. And the more destructive the authorized effect becomes, the less forgiving that error is. The million-dollar bond illustrates the problem almost perfectly. The memorandum permits DOJ and DHS to require participating companies to maintain a bond or escrow of at least $1 million that can be forfeited for contractual non-compliance. As a symbol of responsibility, that makes sense. As a mechanism for regulating strategic cyber risk, it is almost comically mismatched to the scale of possible consequences. For a major technology or defense corporation, $1 million is not a meaningful deterrent against an operation attached to a large government contract. For a small specialist cybersecurity firm, $1 million may be a substantial barrier to entry. Thus, the same requirement risks being simultaneously too small to discipline the largest participants and too large for some of the smallest. And consider the underlying liability. Suppose an unauthorized destructive action interrupts a major cloud provider. Suppose it corrupts industrial equipment. Suppose it disrupts a financial exchange. Suppose an error causes several $100 million in economic damage. What exactly does forfeiting $1 million bond accomplish? The answer exposes a broader truth. Cyber operations cannot be governed adequately through ordinary contractor performance mechanisms. This is not a janitorial contract. Who gets to own the weapons? Another problem receives less attention, but may ultimately be more important. The program will create privileged companies. To perform these missions effectively, some participants will need access to offensive tooling, exploit chains, malware analysis capabilities, targeting intelligence, infrastructure maps, zero-day vulnerabilities, or classified information unavailable to ordinary competitors. Membership could therefore become an extraordinarily valuable commercial asset. A company admitted into the program might gain government contracts, relationships with intelligence agencies, access to threat information, experience performing operations competitors cannot legally perform, recruiting prestige, technical knowledge, and perhaps insight into vulnerabilities affecting widely deployed commercial products. That creates a gatekeeping problem. Who gets admitted? According to the memorandum, both large firms and smaller specialist companies are supposed to participate, but who decides which companies are sufficiently trustworthy? What prevents political favoritism? What prevents procurement relationships from hardening into a permanent offensive cyber oligopoly? What happens when a company simultaneously sells cybersecurity products to the public and conducts classified offensive operations for the government? What happens when that company competes against another company that lacks access to the intelligence feeding those operations? Government contracting has always produced industrial constituencies. A permanent offensive cyber contracting sector would be no exception. The most dangerous incentive may be the simplest one. A security company normally profits when customers perceive threats and purchase protection. Under this program, a participating company might additionally profit by identifying a threat, characterizing it, proposing an operation against it, and receiving government money to execute that operation. That creates a structural conflict of interest. Former Cyber Command official Jason Kitka summarized the concern memorably after the memorandum was announced, describing the concept as potentially producing a machine for continuously billable threats. CyberScoop reported both enthusiastic and critical responses from former officials and industry figures. The problem does not require corruption. Ordinary institutional incentives are enough. If organizations are rewarded for finding problems that justify additional operations, they will become extraordinarily good at finding such problems.